I'm Roger Moody, and I have been working for my pains or otherwise for the past 30 years on mining issues globally. This has taken me all the way from Cornwall, which is the most mined part of Britain, all the way across the world as far as Australia, Latin America, South Africa, and so on. My interest was first captured as a journalist working with an Australian Aboriginal support organisation in London, visited in the late 1970s by some Aboriginal leaders who said, what about this company called Rio Tinto? We know it's the world's biggest mining company, it's on our land, it shouldn't be. Will somebody do something about this? And following that, a campaign was set up in this country called People Against RTZ, as it then was, Partisans. And it's probably the longest continual campaign focused on one specific company anywhere in the world. But I mean, I think the first thing to point out is that degeneration of nuclear energy is not, as is often represented by the industry and indeed many politicians. First of all, it's not a closed cycle. The term nuclear fuel cycle is often used, but in fact the whole process is a sieve. In effect, it has leakages, and sometimes quite dangerous leakages, all the way from the mine, the production of the fuel in its ore form, uranium oxide, all the way through to the disposal of waste. And what I'm concentrating on obviously tonight is that what's called the front end of the nuclear process. Secondly, claims that nuclear energy is clean, carbon-free, carbon emissions-free, is a complete myth. And that's mainly because the global greenhouse gas emissions, not only carbon dioxide but methane, for example, are most concentrated at that front end, at the mining end. Thirdly, and perhaps equally if not more important, is the fact that all mining carries risk. All mining produces waste. What distinguishes the waste from the uranium mines from any other waste, from any other type of mining, is the fact that it is radioactive. And there's something called the uranium decay process. It happens the moment that you expose the uranium ore body to the air, and that uranium decay process can last for hundreds of thousands of years until it stabilizes as lead, after literally hundreds of thousands of years. And all the way along that process, from the moment you lift your first shovel or your first dig, there is the danger of that exposure, and it's exposure which affects and has killed many miners, especially in Africa and in Australia and in Mexico. In New Mexico, or the Four Corners region of the United States, which is the subject of a film I hope to show this evening, and also at the stage of processing that fuel. So all the way along the journey, you have the dangers, you have the carbon emissions, or big toll in carbon emissions, and then at the end of the day, of course, you're left with this huge process, which does preoccupy a lot of people quite rightly, which is what you do with those wastes at the end of this process, whose radioactivity is fated, because we've never discovered any way of reducing or neutralizing it to last for generation after generation. So that's my message. Certainly, the cheaper, the more high grade, and the cheaper, because it's been easier to pull out of the ground, uranium, we're seeing the end of that. A lot of uranium during the 1990s came from nuclear weapons under the the implementation of Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But in a few years' time, that's going to be out. And that was the easiest way to acquire uranium supplies. Now the industry is being forced to acknowledge that mine after mine is being put on the back burner because, for a number of different reasons. It could be because it doesn't have the capital, it could be because it's the ore body is discovered or wants to exploit is the lower grade than it thought of originally, but a lot of it has to do with politics, and in particular what I call the implications of conflict minerals. I mean, we know about conflict minerals, many people in the context of stuff like coltan coming out of the DR Congo, the implications of US legislation such as the Dodd-Frank Act forbidding the processing and sale of such minerals, and so-called conflict blood diamonds. I think everybody's aware of that. My view is that the term conflict minerals should cover a much wider range of minerals and should address any area or any substance that's extracted that is clearly flying in the face of the interests, concerns, and sometimes many times the livelihoods of those who are literally sitting on the ore body. And as such, I think uranium represents one of the worst conflict minerals on the planet today, and it's particularly evident. I've been looking at, I think it's well known in this area, that if Hinkley C goes ahead, I don't think we should say that that's been written in stone at the moment. But if Hinkley C, then as we know, it will be run by EDF, and EDF, in cooperation with Areva, will supply various technology, construction, and critically will supply the uranium. That's as far as we know. It will supply the uranium for Hinkley C. And I think it's relevant to mention in Central African Republic, because it's only been in the last few weeks that there have been news items showing the appalling suffering that's going on there in the conflict, and a lot of that conflict is actually centred on one of Areva's newest mines, the Bakuma mine in the Central African Republic. Unfortunately, Niger is a closed country. Yes. I mean, it's a country which is being invaded, if you read much of the press, by Islamic groups, and there are Tuaregs who've been opposed to uranium mining in the country, and Areva's in particular, because they said, we had water then, yes, we had enough to feed our cattle, the wells are dry, the livestock is already dead. And whether or not that has actually stimulated or encouraged the attacks on Areva's facilities, and there have been 3 attacks over the last 3 years on their mine and their plants in Niger, is, I think, still an open question. The French assisting in the Malian government to fight off the so-called rebels from the north, and in Niger, in fact. Just in the last few months, and sending French special forces to protect Areva's uranium facilities in Niger. Now, inevitably, the Hinkley Point C plans go ahead. It's almost certain that uranium will come from Niger, because it's actually the biggest source of uranium for Areva. In my experience, mining has been regarded as such as a back issue, as a one you put down the agenda. It's remarkable that right up until literally the 1990s, so not that long ago, none of the big campaigning organizations, whether development organizations or environmental organizations like WWF, for example, even had the impacts of mining on their agenda. Now, this changed a lot, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. So now it's almost gone in the opposite direction, where just about every development organization says, we have to address the impacts of mining. The problem is that with oil, for example, you can always tie it to the consumer outlets. You can say, what's Shell doing in Nigeria? Boycott Shell at the petrol pump. That's very difficult, and continues to be very difficult when it comes to mined material. And in terms of uranium, interestingly enough, I didn't know this, although I've professed to have studied and be knowledgeable about mining industry in Devon and Cornwall, and indeed in Gloucestershire. I didn't know until I came across a YouTube video just a couple of weeks ago that there had in fact been a uranium mine in Cornwall, which lasted for nearly 60 years, and was supplying uranium. Well, it was supplying radium-226, but uranium was being dug up. Radium-226 was being processed from that. It's one of the so-called decay products of uranium, and this was being sold to the Joliot-Marie Curie laboratory in France. And indeed, for a period, the French came over and took over this company, which closed in 1933, but during the 1920s it was actually run by the French, and it's the headwaters of the File River down in close to St Austell. I didn't realise that. Professing to be an expert, especially on local or regional mining. So I should mention this: there are also, just in the last few months, been two successes. One Aboriginal group led by a woman called Eva Maragula, having got Rio Tinto to agree to incorporate part of its huge lease in the Northern Territory called Ranger into a national park, which is also a World Heritage Site. And another Aboriginal group actually that would have been affected by a REVA, also securing rights to their own land and probably scotching another mine of Ureva in the northern end of Australia. So